Hey, what's up you guys? My name is Amber, welcome to my channel, and today we're going to be discussing We Should All Be Feminists, an essay by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. The book itself really is quite short, to be frank. If you can see, it is an incredibly small, tiny book running about 50 pages because it is actually an essay that was adapted from a verbal TED Talk that the author gave back in 2012. Because the essay itself is so short, instead of doing my normal format with book discussions, which would generally be to share a brief summary, I do think it would be more beneficial to share a few direct quotes from the text itself.
I was about 14. We were in his house arguing, both of us bristling with half-baked knowledge from the books we had read. I don't remember what this particular argument was about, but I remember that as I argued and argued, Oklahoma looked at me and said, "You know, you're a feminist." It was not a compliment. I could tell from his tone. I did not know exactly what this word feminist meant, and I did not want Oklahoma to know that I didn't know, so I brushed it aside and continued to argue. The first thing I planned to do when I got home was look up the word in the dictionary. At some point, I was a happy African feminist who does not hate men and who likes to wear lip gloss and high heels for herself and not for men. Of course, much of this was tongue-in-cheek, but what it shows is how that word feminist is so heavy with baggage, negative baggage. You hate men, you hate bras, you hate African culture, you think women should always be in charge, you don't wear makeup, you don't shave, you're always angry, you don't have a sense of humor, or you don't use deodorant. We spend too much time teaching girls to worry about what boys think of them, but the reverse is not the case. We don't teach boys to care about being likable. We spend too much time telling girls that they cannot be angry or aggressive or tough, which is bad enough, but then we turn around and either praise or excuse men for the same reasons. We do a great disservice to boys in how we raise them. We stifle the humanity of boys. We define masculinity in a very narrow way. Masculinity is a hard, small cage, and we put boys inside this cage. We teach boys to be afraid of fear, of weakness, of vulnerability. And then we do a much greater disservice to girls, because we raise them to cater to the fragile egos of men. We teach girls to shrink themselves, to make themselves smaller. We say to girls, you can have ambition, but not too much. You should aim to be successful, but not too successful, otherwise you will threaten the man. If you are the breadwinner in your relationship with a man, pretend that you are not, especially in public, otherwise you will emasculate him. But what if we question the premise itself? Why should a woman's success be a threat to a man? Some people ask, why the word feminist? Why not just say you are a believer in human rights or something like that? Because that would be dishonest. Feminism is, of course, part of human rights in general. But to choose to use the vague expression human rights is to deny the specific and particular problem of gender. Some people will say, well, poor men also have a hard time, and they do. But that is not what this conversation is about. Gender and class are different. Poor men still have the privileges of being men, even if they do not have the privileges of being wealthy. I learned a lot about systems of oppression and how they can be blind to one another by talking to black men. I was once talking about gender, and a man said to me, "Why does it have to be you as a woman? Why not you as a human being?" This type of question is a way of silencing a person's specific experiences. Of course, I am a human being, but there are particular things that happen to me in the world because I am a woman. This same man, by the way, would often talk about his experience as a black man. I very often think of my friend Oklahoma. And he was right that day, many years ago, when he called me a feminist. I am a feminist. And when, all those years ago, I looked the word up in the dictionary, it said feminist, a person who believes in the social, political, and economic equality of the sexes.
The text itself is told through the perspective of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie as a Nigerian woman, and it does give a lot of personal examples in between a lot of these quotes. Being a 50-page essay, it is obviously a very short and quick read. I do think that a lot of important points are made and that it does a fairly decent job at touching upon a lot of broad issues that are faced in feminism today. And it also briefly touches upon the differences between gender, class, and race issues that I do think is an important conversation to have that I would like to see more of in the future, and how all of these different issues are treated differently by different people. This particular essay treats it more like they're all separate issues, whereas I'm of the mind that they are all individual issues that have a lot of overlap and therefore need to be addressed in a variety of ways. So for example, like as a perceived woman, I have less privilege than a man, but as a white woman, I have more privilege than women of color, but that's not inherently like a feminist issue or a racial issue. It's both and should be treated on both sides of the spectrum. The essay is written with the traditional gender binary very, very prevalent and doesn't really take into consideration anybody who falls outside of that traditional gender binary, including trans folk and non-binary folk. The text is also very heteronormative, especially when it comes to a lot of its co-ed examples, and doesn't generally take into, or actually doesn't take the queer community into consideration at all, which I did find to be quite odd. considering Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is an activist who is allegedly very outspoken for LGBT rights in Nigeria. So there's one issue that I have not only with this work, but with a lot of feminist works that I have read, where there's this phenomena of women making the argument of wanting to embrace traditional femininity and having this argument that like they can be a feminist while still being like highly feminine and girly and liking things like makeup and fashion, which is absolutely the case. Like 100%, being a feminist does not dictate at all the type of person you are, other than the fact that you believe in the equality of all people, regardless of gender. So it really bothers me when they make this argument simply because it is usually, and especially like in this work, it is accompanied with the argument that it's like, I'm a feminist, but I'm not that kind of feminist, you know? Like, I'm not the kind of feminist who burns bras and doesn't shave and, you know, blah, 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 blah. And, like, that's absolutely fine. You can be a super, like, highly feminist. Fantastic. But in the process of doing so, you don't have to stigmatize or demonize or discount those who aren't super highly femme. You know, like there are some women who are more masculine or some more, you know, androgynous and gender neutral who do not at all conform to traditional gender roles. So, you know, you don't have to be like, oh, I'm a feminist, but I'm not this kind of feminist, because it absolutely discounts all of the women who are like that. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't understand how you can make the argument of being a feminist when you're going to pit yourself against other women. And that's what these authors are doing, whether or not they realize that that's what they're doing, because then it creates a stigma and a certain feeling towards another type of woman. Well, that was not at all the main point of this particular text. Like, that is super, super common in a lot of feminist arguments. And I think it's an argument we need to stop having. And again, you know, 2014 was definitely a little bit of a different time than it is now in 2021. Like, 2014 was definitely kind of the era of, you know, like Tumblr social justice, and you know, the word feminazi was thrown around a lot, and the, you know, feminist was still considered to be more of a bad word. So I do understand where some of the argument is coming from, but I don't think that it is relevant today or necessarily justified in any day. Overall, though, I do think that there were a lot of really good arguments made in the book. There are definitely a ton of great quotables from the book, both that I featured in my summary and otherwise. With that being said, I don't feel comfortable praising her work, and I don't feel comfortable endorsing her work at all, knowing that. I do think that she has made a lot of good points in the argument of feminism, but I also believe that if your feminism is exclusive to anybody, then it's not valid. If it's not intersectional, it's not feminism. Yourself. So everything that I have said about the text is true. I do think that a lot of really good points are made, and that in certain aspects there is a lot that could be learned from this perspective, but I also do not support the financial support of Adichie. So I would very highly recommend, if you are interested, please go to a library, like read it in the bookstore and borrow it from somebody else if you want. I think that it's really, really unfortunate because Adichie has done a lot for feminism, and especially in Africa and for Nigerian women, but for that to discount so many people who are in the trans and the queer community is insulting. Adichie doesn't say that she has anything against people who are trans. She just categorizes them separately from people who are cis, which obviously in certain aspects there are going to be certain differences that are notable in certain situations, but that doesn't mean that you can discount them from conversations about gender. And I don't feel comfortable supporting the author. Similarly to J.K. Rowling, you know, I am someone who very, very greatly loves the Harry Potter series very deeply, but I also do not any longer support the financial encouragement of J.K. Rowling. In the context of J.K. Rowling, I feel like obviously I fucking love Harry Potter, but Harry Potter is not necessarily educationally important, whereas conversations about feminism are. So like with Adichie, I can make the statement that I do think she has made a lot of good arguments, but they are not necessarily inclusive, so they're not as important as other people's arguments. And I really should have done more research before I went into this review. Otherwise, I may have considered not doing the review at all. But on the flip side, I do also think it's a really important conversation to have. The fact that we're still making the argument about inclusiveness and intersectionality within the feminist movement is so frustrating. I don't understand why we can't just accept all women and femme-aligned people. I mean, obviously anybody, because technically feminism is the equality of genders. So like, why are we excluding any particular gender, no matter what the specifics are? If it weren't obvious, I am definitely somebody who believes in intersectionality and feminism and inclusiveness. Like, I'm not discounting anybody from that conversation. I wish I could say my normal. It was a blast hanging out with y'all, but unfortunately this was more of an unexpected, unfortunate turn. So for now, I will just have to say, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.